So again, thank you for inviting me, and yeah, I'm happy to see that many people here, and I want to share with you some of my experiences with photography and tell you a little bit about my work. So maybe first I'm gonna just tell you a little bit about myself. I work with historical photographic processes. I'm an artist, photographer, and also a workshop leader. So I lead workshops in processes like collodion, cyanotype, salted paper print, and all of the historical 19th century processes. And I came to London about 3 years ago to do my master's in London College of Fashion, and since then I started developing my own career towards working with the wet collodion process. Before I came in here, I did study in Poland. I'm Polish, and I did my BA in Poznań, where I lived a few years and started developing interest in historical photographic processes, started working with it, but it really kind of started for me more professionally when I sort of discovered the wet collodion process, and since my studies, I really sort of want to work with that process, but it seemed very technically challenging, very much chemistry based. So I just wanted to maybe tell you a few words about the process itself, because some of you may be already familiar with it, some of you not. So I started this presentation with just a basic sort of explanation of wet collodion process, since it's the process I use the most in my artwork. So just a little bit about the process, and a little bit of an example here, and I have a few sort of real life examples here as well, which you can you're welcome to have a look afterwards. The collodion process is basically sort of a glass plate process, and it's based on a large format camera. So we're working with within a photographic darkroom using chemicals like collodion, silver nitrate, and the photographer is also a chemist in a way, working with the wet collodion. So it's kind of like a big part of work is to manage the darkroom, create chemicals on your own. So it's a little bit more complex than making, for example, silver gelatin prints. There's much more chemistry involved, and there's also an aspect of a darkroom, and wherever you go with your wet collodion process, you need to take a darkroom with you. That's why it's a wet process, so it needs to be developed straight away. And I have a little video to show you that just shows sort of the basics of the process. Just a very quick one, so you have some idea of how it looks like. It's a little bit dark. But yeah, that's kind of like a large format camera. We're preparing the plate in a dark room. Every plate you prepare before you take a shot, so you can prepare it in advance. It's sort of ad hoc. You create a scene. You have a portrait, for example. You ask the person to sit in front of the camera, and you prepare your plate just before you take a photograph. So there's about 10 minutes between you make a plate and you have to develop it. So this time frame is really short, and in order to take a photograph, you need to expose for a couple of seconds. So the exposure actually takes quite a bit of time. You have to have your model very still, and then you have to develop it straight away.
Is that a positive process, or do you go through a negative first?
We have both positive and negative, which is really interesting thing about collodion, and maybe, I don't know if you all will be able to see it in here, but I have both positive and negative in here, and with the collodion we basically are able to do both in the same time, however that might sound. If you work, for example, with the transparent glass, as I have in here, and we view it on a white backing, we'll be able to see the negative. And when we add a piece of black backing, it may be in here, you should be able to see the positive image. So you have sort of like both in one object. And in here, you can also paint the back black and have sort of a positive straight away. Or you can do it on a transparent glass and make prints from it and then enlarger afterwards, or do a contact print with it. So there's like many options. You can scan it and enlarge later on. And it has a very good quality as well, because it's a large format image, so you can really blow it up to a very high extent, I would say. And yeah, let me just turn it off, go back to the presentation. Yeah, so do you have any questions about the process itself, or is it alright to just go ahead? Yeah? Alright, just a second. So yeah, here I just have like a few names that you might have heard of from the history of photography, that like Julia Margaret Cameron or Roger Fenton, who you could see his exhibition lately in Buckingham Palace. They have been like pioneers of wet collodion process from 19th century. And Roger Fenton, for example, was one of the first to photograph war. So these are first war photographs ever taken, and they've been taken using wet collodion process, which is kind of bizarre, because in the collodion process you have this time that you have to take exposure for a couple of seconds, so it's not really possible to take a war photograph in action. So most of those photographs were just staged. But anyways, they're regarded as the first one. And Julia Margaret Cameron, who you might have heard about, in Victoria and Albert Museum, they have a great collection of her photographs. She was one of the first women as well for using that particular process, and she was a little bit forgotten in her times, but she did a lot of portraits of great artists at the time, and yeah, she was one of the first women in photography as well. So they are also kind of my inspiration. So I wanted just to show you guys who inspire me for my own projects. And now on to some personal projects using the wet plate. I'm going to show you my BA project, which I did a couple of years ago in Poland. And it's a project about my grandma. So they're wet collodion photographs. They're kind of like inspired by very first photographs of Indians and kind of ethnological books. So it's a sort of interpretation of ethnological investigation, which I did with my grandma. So it's a sort of like a story, a made-up story really, but the one that shows how you can incorporate the wet collodion into some contemporary artistic practice. So just a few more photographs. And I have one example in here, which you can later have a look at. A few more examples. And it was really kind of like a project when I tried to sort of find a way to incorporate these very old techniques and make kind of sense of them, because really often really like them for their visual qualities. They're very haunting, and I really kind of try to find some other ways to incorporate them into the work other than just visual qualities. And I always think that the collodion also have some sort of a narrative of its own, so you can see it as like another voice within that image as well. And because it's a very different way of working with the camera, with large format camera, with the chemistry. Actually, the most of the time you take photograph, you spend in a dark room rather than with the model or with the image. So you work in a very different way. It makes you think about an image in a different way that the working with digital camera does. And when I was starting out, that was sort of like a thing that was really attractive to me. It kind of slowed me down, made me think about a singular image. And if I think about wet plate and how much time it takes to make one photograph, it's about, I would say, half an hour at best. It might be even more. There were days when I was making that project that I would just have one day and make one photograph. So I think sometimes even working with other processes, it's interesting to think what would you do if you could just take one photograph during the whole day. What would your photograph look different to what you would do if you had hundreds and hundreds of them? So I just think it's an interesting thing to think about. And yeah, it just slows you down a lot, and that's something I enjoy about the process and also the craft of it. The fact that even after a couple of years working with the collodion, I still make my own mistakes. It still surprises me, and there's still things that I don't know about it. So you can never be actually sure if you got this image in the end, because it's all based on chemistry, it's all handmade, so you can see that hand, and we can all make mistakes along the way. So yeah, it's always kind of like surprising what the effect that you come up with, and similar in that kind of ethnological investigation that I try to lead. It was also like important to reflect on the ways that, for example, the Native Americans were photographed in the past, and I kind of, especially in that first photograph, I sort of tried to interpret that and make a story of my own based on those images that of 19th century documentaries that I was inspired by. So yeah.
Can I ask about so
Go ahead.
Your models, I mean, obviously, like, it affects you, that you know that you can only take one shot maybe a day, I guess, yeah?
Yeah.
How about the models, if they know that there's only, because obviously, like, they're the subjects, they're the performers, yeah?
Yeah.
So it must affect them in a way, so they know that there's nothing like a second chance or like a snapshot, yeah?
Yeah, it definitely affects that, yeah.
How's the relationship between you and the model? Do they want to have a lot of direction, or do you opt for, let's say, something very static? I don't know. How do you approach it in general, like on a creative level?
Oh, it really depends on the situation. In terms of like this particular project, I worked with sort of my own grandma, so it was a little bit maybe different to if I would to work with some models, and so there was sort of a relationship with her, and she sort of like, I felt like she respects that process as well, so she acknowledges that there's only one shot and tries to make the best of it, but also being like respectful for the medium as well, which I find really really interesting, the way like people respond to the process and to the large format camera in comparison to a more modern method. There is this sort of like and respect, and they sort of feel like there's something important happening here, and then it makes them, I guess, feel more engaged in a way, I would say. And it's often like we don't pose for a couple of hours, it's only a couple of seconds when I require the person in front of the camera to act, so it's a sort of very intense moment, I would say, with the model. So I always try to base it on some sort of relationship, even if I don't work with someone who's a member of my family. I would always try to talk with them first, meet up first, and kind of prepare them for what is to come, and build this sort of relationship beforehand, and just let them know what's happening. Because people are also very stressed sometimes in front of like, oh, there's only one photograph, and you know, I won't look good, or I will make a funny face and it won't work. So I try to always calm them down, and there's always a second chance. It just takes a little bit longer than usual, but it's not only one I can make. Maybe 8 is like my daily maximum that I can make. If I have a friend of mine who also works with the wet plate, I think when we worked together, our maximum was 20 per day. So that was like the highest maximum of plates we could do together. But yeah, it definitely makes this relationship with the photographed person a little bit different. And yeah, I think that's a good moment to move to the other project, because I will tell you a bit about relationship with that other group of people that I photographed. These are just some places where I showed this project, so maybe I come back to it in a moment. But yeah, in terms of like relationship with people who I photographed, there is this other project that I made. I call it the Crafters, and it's inspired by August Zander work. I don't know if you have heard about him before, but I was really kind of inspired by this quote over here. We know that the people are formed by light and air, by their inherited traits and their actions. We can tell from the appearance the work someone does or does not do. We can read the face whether he's happy or troubled. So that was my kind of a quote from August Zander, and I had this group of people that I worked with towards making a portrait of this community of crafters that was based back in Poland, in Poznań, and me and my friends from the photograph, the bakers, we got funding from the city to make a sort of portrait of the community of the crafters in Poznań, and it sort of was a really interesting project on that level of relationship with the people that I photographed, because we all had like a craft in common, which was really interesting. So they were bakers, they were makers, like over here, and we were setting up a studio inside of the bakery, and then all the local makers and bakers and cooks, they could come in and have their photograph taken in wet collodion process as a sort of reminiscence of August Zander work that he did photographing a German nation. So yes, have one example here from that project, from the first photograph. Okay, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to ask.
Do you
Yeah.
practice, well not practice, but do you start with, I don't know if it's just occurred to me, would you start with the digital camera first, take a couple of shots, see if the pose is alright, is that what you want, and then do your thing on the large format camera with the collodion, or you just go straight ahead to the collodion?
No, I would usually, I really kind of like enjoy this little tension between like the people I photograph and the fact that we don't have that much shots in there. So I would go just straight ahead to the large format. Yeah, I guess I don't think that's like there's a wrong and right way. It's just how I approach it, just because it makes me think in a different way. If I shoot many digital photographs and then just pick one, maybe I would come up with a different outcome, who knows, but I don't think there is like good or right or wrong. Yeah, it just depends.
I have a technical question.
Yeah.
It seems that you control the light with chronometer or something, so I think you get light for a couple of seconds.
Mm-hmm.
But your images are so sharp for that. So I can understand that people are standing still, but you can't stand still for 2 seconds to still get this sharpness. So is it because of a process of chemical? It takes image immediately and process late. So how is this possible?
Well, you have because also it's like a different format. You have the large format of the negative. It's also a much better rendition of detail. Even if we have a slight movement, it wouldn't. You would see it if I blow it up, do it like hundreds of centimeters. We probably would see a little bit of movement, but also because of the size of the negative, all of them seem very sharp, and plus I have my ways of posing people, so make them sharp. And in the past they would have this kind of clamp for the head for people to stay still, because some of the very early daguerreotypes, early little photographs on copper plate, they would take half an hour to expose and people were still very sharp. So what they would do, they would just clamp your head like this and wish you won't blink or move in that time. So there are some ways you can make people still without that being very obvious. I have some, I usually pose them in front of the wall. You can see in most of the photographs there's some sort of wall, and because we work with the large format camera, you can tilt and shift so that you can move the sharpness in various ways, maybe towards the face, maybe towards some other details. So when working with the large format, you will have all of these options, like focusing all of the sharpness only on the face, so that makes this impression even sort of deeper. So yeah, if we were to blow them very much, there would be some slight movement, I would say. But yeah, you can make people very still by just placing them on a wall and having some sort of pillow in the back. Yeah, I used many methods to make them very still, but some of these portraits I also take in the daylight, because with the wet collodion it's a little bit different than other methods in a way that you can't really measure the exposure exactly, because it doesn't work. The emulsion doesn't work the same way as like a gelatin silver film. So it's sensitive to the UV light, to the UV spectrum of light, and because of that there's no like a way to just measure it with a light meter and have the ready exposure time. We can sort of judge it. We know that the plate has a sensitivity of about 3 ISO, which is very low, but within that 3 there is always we can measure it for free, but it will never give us the sort of right answer. It's just an estimation. It depends on the time of the day. If we work with the daylight, the UV levels are different throughout the day and even the time of the year. So it's purely by experimenting and just judging it by experience that you say how many seconds. And the best effects I got with the daylight, they are from 3 to 7 seconds, I would say. My exposure times up to 10 seconds, but you can work with it in a studio as well. So let me just see. Oh, there's one more.
Sorry, can I?
Yeah.
So is it only sensitive to UV light or also to...
Mainly, it is sensitive to UV light mainly, so not the whole spectrum of light, and that also makes it look a little bit different than a regular photograph, because it just sees the world in an entirely different way that we do or other emulsions do.
Can you go back like 2 slides?
Yeah.
Like the woman there on the
Yeah.
right hand side.
Yeah, here.
What it seems to be doing is it gives this incredibly beautiful, like bronzen skin tone. This kind of shine, it almost looks like as if it's like covered like with some sort of like bronze or like some sort of metal. It has this incredibly fantastic skin tone. Maybe it comes like from the fact that it's sensitive to UV light, so it renders skin in a
different way. Yeah. Because it goes more towards sort of the red, and the red is the one that the emulsion just doesn't see, because we work with the red light in the dark room. So the emulsion of collodion doesn't really see red, so every kind of little shadow, it will just pick it up.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that, which you mentioned in the workshop, is that tattoos don't show up because of that.
Yeah, they might not show up if they're like blue, for example. It might sort of like not show up that much. Yeah, or if you like wearing a red lipstick, it will show up very, very dark, as if you have like a black lipstick, for example. So we work in a bit of a different way as well in terms of the colors. Because most colors like red or green or yellow, it just doesn't recognize.
That's why it's probably so nice for Native Americans, no? Because
Yes. Yes, probably. What else do I have here? Oh, there's just another project that I have also with the wet plate that I've all done when I was already living in London. And it's a sort of a reflection about my Slavic heritage and kind of folklore. And because I did the masters in London College of Fashion, there is this sort of element of folk costume that is in that project. So just a few examples in here. And there's some color that I've added after the scanning. So in this project, I try to sort of take all of those clothes out of the closets of the museums and cultural centers, and they're Polish folklore costumes from the region that I lived in, Poland, and I try to give them sort of second life, kind of reanimate them a little bit, and sort of reflect on the idea of originality of the object as well, that comes together with the collodion plate as well. We have this sort of singular object really often. We can make prints obviously from a negative, but what I often do is just make a singular kind of plate that is painted black in the back, so that the outcome is a singular object, one plate, and I try to kind of merge that with the idea of original costumes that I've borrowed from various places around Poland. Yeah, and there's also this idea of specific customs that I try to illustrate using the costumes. So on the left we have Turoń, which is a kind of like an animal that belongs to this custom in Poland of singing carols during New Year's. Which is still happening in some rural places in Poland. And the other one on the right, we call it Dziad Śmiguśny in Polish, and it's a costume that is often made during the April, during the Easter time, and it is a kind of like a contest and welcoming the spring kind of thing in one particular part of Poland. So I just went there and borrowed those costumes from the people in small cultural centers that were running this kind of events in there, and sort of try to sort of rediscover all of that customs and beliefs. And I read all of these books about like demons that people used to believe in before the Christianity came into Poland. So some pagan kind of folklore tales. This was kind of my inspiration for that project. And a few more examples illustrating that. There's one more over here, one plate from that particular series. I don't know if you can see it really well and have a look later on. Yeah, just a few places that I showed this project on. I've brought some magazine covers that I've asked for these photographs later on, and some interviews with me that have been published in Black and White magazine, and an exhibition that has been done in Slovenia on sort of Eastern European artists. So these are just a few photographs from that exhibition.
How do you color the images?
Yeah. I would just sort of scan it and color it digitally.
Okay.
But I'm working on like manually coloring them as well. But I think a good thing about the digital, which I incorporate often in my workshops as well, making large format negatives. So it's not something I reject working with these alternative processes. And the good thing about it is that you can, make errors as well. And I found this method of layering original plate with sort of a scan and colored method. It's kind of like I scan the image, I colorize it, and then I can separate the color from an image and layer those two images together to give the impression of color. And that also helps me in that journey of learning of how to hand paint them. So it's like a step in hand painting them, because that's something that is really, really hard. And in the past it would belong to painters who painters would be sort of retouchers, and they would paint photographs in the very early days when color photography wasn't around. So that's something that I still work on and develop, yeah. And it's also like a good point to tell about the digital as well. As I mentioned, I often use it for my workshops when printing, using some or demonstrating some of the really old photographic methods like collodion, for example. I find that it's like a great learning tool as well, because there are some processes that you just can't do other way than creating some digital negative. So that's something I teach to people during the workshops as well, how to incorporate those two, use all of these digital methods of printing that we have today and combine them with those really old and historic processes. What else? Just some other things. Yeah, the studio and workshops. Yeah, I just wanted to tell you briefly what I do in my studio. Part of my practice as a photographer happens in my studio that is based in Poland Street. For anyone who would like to ever visit, you're very welcome. I do wet plate portraits for the clients or private clients or for brands, magazines. I work with a portraiture mainly, on some still life as well. Some examples in here. These are just some portraits that I have taken for the client. The other part of what I do there are the workshops and the teaching. And I started out teaching in various places, museums and galleries, and my university that I studied in. So I did some workshops with the British Museum, with the University of Arts London, with Spike Gallery in Bristol. There are just some of the photographs from the workshops and some methods that I teach, like solarography over here. Then we have sort of camera obscura workshops over here and there, some cyanotype workshops, yeah, there are also like very old techniques that I try to rediscover, like electrophotography. So the other part of my sort of me working as in photography is also rediscovering all of these forgotten methods that not many people know about. And yeah, there are just some other workshops, as I mentioned, stereo photography. There's very interesting as well. Our first 3D photographs, salted paper print, very first print method. Anthotype, which is really very interesting one because it's a prehistory of photography. It's a method of printing with plant juices, obtaining images just using plants. So yeah, there are just some different things that I teach in the studio. Also the basics of working with film and with large format camera as well, and just general silver gelatin darkroom. And yes, some other projects that I work on or worked on at the moment. On the left, it's a project that I work with a dry collodion method and working on a project with called British Landscape. It's something, it's still in progress. I'm rediscovering the dry collodion method that is very little known about. And it's sort of a method of giving the collodion photographs that look like those in here, but using the method to prepare them in advance and take photographs on the day, so without a darkroom for travel photography. But this particular method, it requires a long exposure times of around 5 to 15 minutes. But instead it gives us this collodion sort of look. So that's something I'm working on at the moment and trying to rediscover it. There's some more kind of commercial things that I've done. This one was a portrait shoot, just few pictures from it for the hair salon, Radio Hair. And we worked with some ideas of Japanese women warriors of the past, and collodion went together with that quite well. Some more sort of advertising the watches for the Protagonist magazine. Yeah, that's also a shoot for the Protagonist magazine. Just some sort of fashion shoot. And this is a project for the again University of Arts London, and these are some examples of electrophotographs, and these are some cyanotypes over here, and it was a project about sort of rediscovering the University of Arts London logo and incorporating some artwork like this one inside those little 2 squares. So these are just some things in progress that I've worked on. We did a project with Photography and Archive Research Center, photographing the members of the archive using different types of process like gum bichromate over here. It's a 3-color gum bichromate process, one of the first color printing processes. Salted paper printing here. Yeah, these are some things that I work at the moment, also kind of extending a project on costumes or folklore costumes from the master's project that I showed you. So these are some other carol singers' costumes that I photographed for that project. And there is another one that I'm hoping to develop. It's a sort of project that comes from my crafters project as well. I'm trying to get some funding from a Polish cultural institution, and it will explore a sort of UNESCO immaterial heritage list and sort of immaterial crafts in a way. And I'll be photographing people who do these kind of crafts that are soon to be forgotten, like lace making or this type of thing. And this is just the last thing that I wanted to show you in terms of like showing a different ways of incorporating photography into some professional work. It's also an interest that I developed recently is photography conservation and collection care. So that's also one of the sort of ways in which I work with photographic processes, with old photographic processes. I did some course in conservation in London Centre for Photographic Conservation, just learning how to, based on my knowledge of processes, learning how to kind of rescue old photographs when they're damaged. Yeah, this is just some work that I did over my course. Oh, and here we had like a class when we learned there's 130 different ways to do wet collodion, and they're all lying in there, and they all have their own names. So yeah, I guess that's all I wanted to show you today. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.